There is something within us that insists on remaining even when everything we know seems to dissolve. Have you noticed how life is marked by moments when time expands and consciousness seems to shift beyond the body? These fleeting, inexplicable instants leave a mark that defies materialist logic. Traditional science insists on treating the mind as the exclusive product of the brain, but this paradigm is beginning to show cracks. Quantum physicists, doctors investigating near-death experiences, and contemporary philosophers converge on a bold hypothesis. Consciousness may be more fundamental than matter. Imagine consciousness as an invisible current flowing through space-time, not bound by the limitations of the body, but connected to a greater network of energy that sustains reality. When this possibility is considered, the fear of death takes on new colors. What we call the end may simply be a transition of frequency, like changing a radio station without the music truly ceasing. This metaphor is not meant as poetic comfort, but as evidence that our essence is not reduced to physical decomposition. The question then is not whether life after death exists, but what the physics of consciousness has to reveal about the immortal nature of the soul. At this crossroads between science and spirituality, the quantum view becomes an unexpected map. It does not eliminate doubt, but transforms it into a driving force for inquiry. And when we dare to follow this path, we discover that consciousness may be the silent proof that the soul never dies. Since the earliest records of philosophy, consciousness has been treated as a riddle that escapes attempts at exact definition. Socrates in Athens spoke of know thyself as a gateway to the mysteries of existence. Millennia later, even with MRIs, algorithms, and sophisticated experiments, the challenge remains. What exactly is this invisible field in which thoughts arise, emotions unfold, and memories are stored? Is it merely a chemical function of the brain, or something that precedes matter itself? Cognitive sciences have advanced by unraveling the complexity of the nervous system, but at the same time have revealed uncomfortable paradoxes. One of them is that nowhere in the brain can we find a single point identifiable as the seat of consciousness. We can locate areas associated with language, movement, or emotion, but the phenomenon of being aware, of having a subjective experience, fits no map. This conceptual gap has led some scientists to propose that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but filtered through it, as if the brain were an antenna tuning into a transmission that already exists on another plane. If we accept this antenna metaphor, we are led to think that the mind is not confined to the skull. This helps explain phenomena that defy reductionist explanations, such as out-of-body experiences reported during comas, or the ability to perceive information without the use of traditional senses. The mystery deepens when we reflect on the fact that each person carries a unique narrative, but one that in essence participates in something shared. We all know what it means to feel pain, joy, or longing, even if in different intensities. Some argue that consciousness is merely an illusion, an inevitable consequence of biological evolution. However, this thesis struggles to account for the intensity of subjective experiences. If everything were an illusion, why does pain feel so real? Why can the beauty of a song or the emotion of a sunset transform us? Materialist science describes how light strikes the retina and generates electrical impulses, but it cannot translate into equations the intimate experience of being moved by nature's spectacle. This abyss between the objective and the subjective is known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem is not explaining how we process information, but understanding why there is the feeling of being present. In other words, why is there someone at home? Why are we not just machines calculating stimuli and responses? This question opens the possibility that consciousness is a fundamental dimension of the universe, like space, time, and energy. In this scenario, the brain would not create consciousness but function as a kind of translator of invisible reality into human experience. This perspective resonates with ancient spiritual traditions, which have always claimed that inner life is broader than the physical body. But at the same time, it echoes recent research in quantum physics, which shows that reality does not behave in a fixed and predictable way when observed. The act of perceiving seems to influence what is perceived, as if consciousness were an active ingredient in the creation of reality. The mystery, therefore, is not only philosophical or religious, but also scientific. This intersection leads us to recognize that perhaps the greatest mistake is trying to reduce consciousness to a single explanation. It reveals itself as a phenomenon that defies all boundaries, moving between the measurable and the immeasurable. With each discovery about the functioning of the brain, new questions arise about what does not fit. At the same time, the deeper we dive into subjective experiences, whether through meditation, altered states of perception, or even existential crises, the more we perceive that there are layers of the mind that cannot be explained solely in biological terms. The mystery of consciousness, far from being a problem to be eliminated, can be understood as an invitation. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of what we know, and at the same time, opens space to explore territories that unite science and spirituality. Perhaps the true richness lies in living with this permanent question, allowing it to keep us moving, in search of meanings that transcend the immediate. Ultimately, what we perceive is that consciousness is not a detail of human life. It is the stage upon which all existence unfolds. Every emotion, every memory, every perception exists only because there is an instance capable of receiving them. To investigate this mystery is, therefore, to investigate the very essence of what it means to be alive. When we talk about quantum physics, the first reaction is usually one of strangeness. Common sense imagines the world as a predictable mechanism, where causes lead to effects in a linear way. However, on a microscopic scale, the laws change. Particles can be in two places at the same time, can behave as a wave or as a particle, and seem to obey not only external forces, but also the way they are observed. It is at this point that the quantum view begins to dialogue with the enigma of consciousness. Reality is not something static and independent, but a field of possibilities in constant update. Experiments of the 20th century, such as the double-slit experiment, challenged the limits of classical physics. When not observed, a particle spreads out like a wave, occupying several potential positions. But the moment someone measures or observes it, this multiplicity collapses into a single defined state. This phenomenon is not just an academic curiosity. It suggests that the act of perceiving actively participates in the construction of reality. In other words, consciousness may not be a mere spectator, but a determining factor in what manifests. This discovery brought profound philosophical implications. If each observer influences in some way the unfolding of possibilities, then reality is less a fixed stage and more a network in permanent creation. This understanding breaks with the idea of the universe as an indifferent machine. On the contrary, it reveals itself as a living, dynamic process, sensitive to interactions. The question that arises is, to what extent does the human mind, as a focus of attention and intention, participate in this process of updating? Some physicists, like John Wheeler, even proposed that the universe truly exists only when it is observed. This radical view, called the participatory anthropic principle, suggests that consciousness did not emerge late as a product of evolution, but has always been present as a fundamental element. If this is true, the reality we experience would not be a distant object, but a mirror of the interaction between the mind and the underlying quantum field. This possibility transforms our perception of ourselves. We are not inert passengers, but co-creators of a flow that transcends us. The language of physics may seem arid, but let us think in metaphors that bring this idea closer. Imagine a symphony where each note exists in potential, waiting to be chosen. The score is not fixed but open, and each time the musician decides to play, the sound crystallizes in the air. So it would be with quantum reality, an ocean of possible notes where consciousness acts as the conductor, selecting what will be heard. This image helps us realize that living is participating in an invisible concert, in which each intention, each choice of attention, carries weight in what manifests. This understanding does not mean that everything is arbitrary, or that we can shape the world however we wish just by thinking. Quantum physics does not legitimize baseless fantasies, but points to the existence of a subtler field in which consciousness interacts with matter. The brain in this scenario would function as a translator of this field, transforming waves of possibility into concrete experiences. The body would thus be an instrument tuned to capture and play the melodies of the universe. When we observe our lives through this lens, we realize that small shifts in consciousness can significantly alter our relationship with events. The attention we give to a situation changes not only how we interpret it, but also how it unfolds. It is as if each gaze were a seed cast into the quantum soil, capable of germinating into unexpected forms. This perception brings a silent responsibility, recognizing that our presence is not neutral. Every act of consciousness is a creative act. Some scholars suggest that this interaction explains why practices like meditation or collective prayer seem to produce measurable, albeit subtle, effects on human behavior and even global indicators. If consciousness truly participates in the quantum field, then states of mental and emotional coherence can amplify harmony in that field, generating consequences that go beyond the individual. This hypothesis, though still controversial, points to the possibility that the human being is connected to a much greater network than individuality supposes. In the quantum view of reality, therefore, there is no rigid separation between subject and object, between observer and observed. What exists is a permanent dialogue, a play of reflections in which consciousness discovers itself as part of the cosmic fabric. Death, from this perspective, loses the appearance of definitive rupture, for what we call the self would not be limited to the physical body, but entwined in a web of possibilities that do not extinguish. Consciousness would be the invisible thread that continues to vibrate even when the material form dissolves. By embracing this view, we begin to see life as a continuous creative process, in which each moment is an update of the field of possibilities. The universe is not a blind machine, but an expanding symphony, and consciousness is one of its essential notes. The mystery of existence ceases to be a burden and becomes a dance between the visible and the invisible, between the act of observing and the reality that reveals itself. If there is a point at which science and spirituality begin to find a common language, it appears in the idea that consciousness can be understood as a form of energy. Not energy in the classical sense like electricity or heat, but as a subtle field that interacts with material processes and in a certain way organizes them. When we reflect on this, the mind ceases to be seen as a shadow that follows the body and comes to be recognized as an active principle, capable of influencing and shaping reality. Modern physics has already shown that everything that makes up the universe is energy in vibration. Matter at bottom is energy condensed into stable patterns. Atoms and molecules are not solid blocks, but incessant dances of particles that appear and disappear in almost musical rhythms. In this context, it is not strange to think that consciousness might be a vibration that participates in this symphony. What we feel as inner presence, that silent I that observes, may be a refined form of energy, not yet fully described by scientific models. The idea of consciousness as energy also helps explain subjective experiences that span cultures and eras. Feelings of expansion during meditative states, perceptions of connection with other people, or even the intuition that something is about to happen can be understood as manifestations of a field that goes beyond the physical body. This energy would not be confined to the brain, but would spread in layers like waves that propagate from an invisible source. Some researchers suggest that this field of consciousness can be compared to a network that connects all living beings. Each individual would function as a node that emits and receives signals, influencing and being influenced by the whole. This view recalls the concept of resonance. When two tuned musical instruments are close, the vibration of one makes the other resonate. In the same way, our mental and emotional states can generate resonances in those around us. How many times have we felt the atmosphere of a room change simply because a person entered? This kind of perception, although difficult to measure, is universally recognized. By understanding consciousness as energy, we also approach the notion that thoughts and emotions have material impact. Neuroscience already shows that thought patterns alter brain chemistry and consequently the entire body. But if we look through a quantum lens, these patterns may extend beyond the limits of the organism, modulating the field of possibilities around us. Thus, each thought is not just an internal event, but an emission that reverberates through the fabric of reality. This approach, however, requires care. Speaking of consciousness as energy does not mean falling into simplifications that reduce all the complexity of the universe to the idea of positive thinking. The energy of consciousness is subtle, but it is not magical. It interacts with other factors such as social contexts, practical choices, and physical limitations. Recognizing its presence does not negate the importance of concrete action, but broadens the view of the impact that each internal state can have on the external world. A useful metaphor is the electromagnetic field around a magnet. Invisible to the eyes, it organizes iron filings into defined patterns. Consciousness as energy would function in a similar way. A silent field that gives shape to experiences, attracting or repelling possibilities. This metaphor is not only poetic, but also practical. By cultivating states of calm, clarity, and coherence, we expand the order of this field, making our perception sharper and our decisions more aligned. This perspective also dialogues with accounts of ancestral practices. In various traditions, breathing is seen as a bridge between body and spirit, as a vehicle of vital energy. The simple act of breathing consciously can alter our physiology and, at the same time, modify the quality of the field of consciousness we radiate. Contemporary science confirms that breathing exercises change heart rate variability, reduce stress levels, and expand the capacity for attention. What was once described as prana or chi now finds explanations in terms of bioelectric coherence, but the principle remains: consciousness is energy in motion. Recognizing consciousness as energy also offers a different view of death. If energy is never lost, only transformed, the same may apply to consciousness. The end of the body would not mean the extinction of what we are in essence, but a transition to another form of manifestation. Just as light passes through different media, changing its speed without ceasing to exist, consciousness could pass through states of being, changing only its frequency. Living from this understanding invites us to care not only for the physical body, but also for the energetic quality of the mind. Each thought is an emission, each emotion a wave that propagates. By nurturing awareness of this dynamic, we become more responsible for the vibrations we radiate into the world. It is a silent invitation to cultivate clarity, compassion, and presence, knowing that these qualities are not confined to the interior, but spread like a field that touches everything around us. In the end, to think of consciousness as energy is to accept that our existence is not an isolated accident, but part of a continuous flow that connects all things. This flow knows no rigid boundaries between life and death, between inside and outside, between self and other. It is the very dance of the universe, and we are its conscious expression. Recognizing this transforms the way we live, for each instant becomes an opportunity to vibrate in tune with the invisible fabric that sustains reality. Few phenomena arouse as much curiosity as near-death experiences, known as NDEs. Accounts from people of different cultures, ages, and beliefs describe moments in which, faced with the interruption of vital functions, a state of expanded consciousness arises. They speak of floating above their own bodies, traveling through tunnels of light, reviewing entire memories in seconds, and feeling an indescribable peace. These accounts repeat with such consistency that it is difficult to dismiss them as mere hallucinations. They point to the possibility that consciousness does not depend exclusively on the brain in order to exist. Traditional medicine explains that, in extreme situations, lack of oxygen in the brain can generate visions, disorientation, and intense sensations. Indeed, part of these descriptions may be related to chemical processes, but there are aspects of NDEs that challenge this explanation. Some people report exact details of conversations or medical procedures that occurred while they were clinically unconscious. Others describe perceiving distant places where relatives or friends were, without any form of physical communication. Such elements suggest that consciousness, in some way, remains active even when vital parameters disappear. Researchers dedicated to this topic have been collecting thousands of testimonies, forming a database rich in similarities. The most intriguing thing is that these narratives do not depend on prior religious beliefs. Atheists report experiences almost identical to those of devout people, as if there were an underlying universal pattern. This universality points to something more than cultural constructions. There seems to be a common structure of consciousness that manifests when the body collapses. From a quantum point of view, these experiences can be seen as signs that the mind is not confined to matter. If consciousness is an independent energy field, clinical death does not extinguish it, but merely frees it from biological limitations. In this state, it could access dimensions of the real that remain hidden in everyday life. The perception of intense light, frequently described, could be the symbolic translation of this contact with a broader reality, impossible to be filtered by the ordinary senses. Another striking feature of NDEs is the feeling of unity. Many report perceiving themselves as integrated into something greater, as if they ceased to be isolated individuals and became part of a luminous whole. This experience of ego dissolution coincides with descriptions of deep meditative states and ancestral spiritual practices. The brain, under normal conditions, seems to function as a limiter that keeps consciousness focused on the here and now. When this filter goes dark, the perception of the infinite emerges. Some research shows that people who have gone through NDEs profoundly transform their lives. They report a loss of fear of death, greater empathy, and a more intense search for meaning. It is as if contact with this expanded state left permanent marks on the psyche. From the point of view of neuroscience, this could be explained as a reconfiguration of neural networks after a trauma. But from a spiritual point of view, it is as if the individual had touched their essential nature and returned with the certainty that consciousness does not go out. There are also accounts of encounters with deceased loved ones. Many describe dialogues, embraces, or simply the loving presence of these people. For skeptics, this would be a product of memory and the emotional need for comfort in moments of crisis. For those who live the experience, however, the feeling is of full reality, as vivid as everyday life. If we consider the hypothesis that consciousness can transcend the body, these encounters can be understood as real contacts in a plane where time and space work differently. NDEs also raise the question of the boundary between life and death. Medicine establishes parameters such as the absence of heartbeat and electrical activity in the brain. However, if there are reports of active consciousness during these states, perhaps the definition of death needs to be revised. This does not mean denying biology, but recognizing that the subjective experience of consciousness does not necessarily end at the same point where the body ceases to function. These phenomena do not offer definitive proof of the immortality of the soul, but they form a mosaic of indications. Each account is like a piece that fits into a larger narrative. That consciousness is capable of crossing borders we thought were insurmountable. And even if they remain mysteries, their existence invites us to look at death not as an absolute end, but as a transition. In the silence of these testimonies, we hear something that resonates beyond reason, the intuition that we are more than flesh and bone, more than memories and chemical impulses. Near-death experiences do not give us all the answers, but they remind us that consciousness is greater than we suppose. And perhaps it is precisely in this mystery that lies the key to understanding why the soul never dies. Among the most fascinating phenomena of quantum physics is entanglement, also called intertwining. It is a mysterious connection between subatomic particles that, even when separated by enormous distances, remain linked in such a way that any change in one of them immediately affects the other. It is as if space did not exist between them, as if they shared an invisible unity. Albert Einstein called this effect spooky action at a distance because it seemed to violate everything that was known about speed and causality. Decades of experiments have confirmed that entanglement is not a trick or an illusion. It is a real aspect of nature, even if it runs counter to common sense. When observing this phenomenon, an inevitable question arises. If particles can remain connected beyond space and time, why not consciousness? Perhaps what we call the soul is precisely the expression of this fundamental interconnection, a quantum thread that links us to something greater and guarantees us continuity even after the dissolution of the physical body. This idea gains strength when we observe how human beings report experiences of deep connection even at a distance. Who has never felt a sudden thought about someone, followed shortly after by a call or news from that person? Science tends to treat such episodes as coincidences, but if viewed in the light of entanglement, they can be seen as flashes of a connection not mediated by space. The soul, in this sense, would not be isolated, but entangled with other consciousnesses and with the very fabric of the universe. This connection does not eliminate individuality, but suggests that we are more than separate entities. The experience of being I may be only a layer of a larger process. Just as entangled particles preserve their identity and at the same time function as a unit, we too could be local expressions of a collective consciousness. This hypothesis radically changes the way we see life and death. If we are entangled at deep levels, death is not a rupture, but a change of state within the same invisible network. There are also powerful ethical implications. If the soul is entangled with others, our actions and thoughts reverberate beyond what we can perceive. Each gesture of kindness, each word of violence, each conscious intention propagates through the field of subtle connections that unites us. We do not live in isolation in our choices. They touch other nodes of the network, feeding harmony or imbalance. This view approaches spiritual teachings that for centuries have affirmed that everything is interconnected, but now gains a language supported by laboratory experiments. From a personal point of view, thinking of oneself as part of a cosmic entanglement can bring comfort in the face of death. If the soul is connected to something that transcends space-time, it cannot be annihilated. The body unravels, but the essence remains in the greater fabric. This echoes in accounts of near-death experiences, where many describe the feeling of unity with a light or a loving presence that cannot be reduced to hallucination. It is as if, at that critical moment, the veil were lifted and the truth of entanglement became evident. But we do not need to wait for life's limit to experience this bond. There are everyday moments that reveal clues to this unity. The shared silence between two people who understand each other without words. The collective emotion at a concert when thousands of hearts seem to beat in unison. The spontaneous empathy that arises when seeing another's suffering. These moments are subtle expressions of entanglement, reminders that the soul is an extension of something much greater than individuality. Living with this awareness invites us to cultivate more attention to the quality of the connections we establish. Just as entangled particles influence each other, our choices influence the invisible weavings that bind us to the world. When we nurture thoughts of clarity, compassion, and presence, we strengthen the network toward harmony. When we feed anger, fear, and indifference, we also radiate these vibrations, impacting the shared field. The recognition of this entanglement gives us back responsibility, and at the same time, the certainty that we are never alone. This perspective also helps us understand the soul's memory. If we are entangled, experiences do not belong only to the individual, but can echo in the collective. Perhaps this explains why certain people feel immediate affinity for places, cultures, or people they have never known before. These connections could be resonances of entanglement, signs of a shared memory that crosses time and space, and it is precisely at this point that an invitation arises. If the soul is entangled with everything that exists, each of us has the ability to reinforce the quality of this network. It is a call to awareness and action. Therefore, upon finishing reflecting on this idea, I leave a simple proposal. Like this content, if it resonated with you, and write in the comments the phrase, "I am part of the network." This gesture, albeit symbolic, is a way of affirming that we recognize our invisible connection and choose to strengthen it with intention. Human life seems to be imprisoned within a chronological thread. We are born, we grow, we age, and we die. This sequence gives us the impression that time is a straight line, with a defined beginning and end. However, both modern physics and deep spiritual experiences suggest that this perception is only a construct. Time may not be absolute, but relative, and what we call the end may be only a transition into another dimension of experience. Einstein's theory of relativity has already revealed that time does not flow in the same way for all observers. It dilates or contracts depending on velocity and gravity. This means there is no universal time that governs all phenomena. What exists are multiple rhythms coexisting. On cosmic scales, past, present, and future, can coexist as parts of the same fabric. This view transforms our relationship with death. If time is not linear, death may not be the cut we imagine, but a passage to another angle of perception. Mystics and meditators describe something similar when they speak of states of consciousness in which the present expands until it swallows past and future. In these experiences, the notion of sequence disappears, and the individual feels faced with an eternity that is not infinite in the sense of duration, but in the sense of fullness. This state suggests that the soul is not bound to the calendar of clocks, but inhabits a plane where experience is broader and free of artificial divisions. It is at this point that the illusion of death begins to unravel. What disappears with death is the physical body, subject to the wear of biological time. But consciousness, if understood as energy or a quantum field, does not dissolve with matter. It only changes frequency, shifting to a rhythm different from what we call everyday life. In the same way that a radio station continues broadcasting, even if we turn off the device, consciousness can continue vibrating in another dimension, invisible to ordinary senses. This understanding gains strength in near-death accounts and in experiences of expanded consciousness, in which time loses its linear character. People describe the sensation of living their entire biography in moments or of perceiving future events as if they were already happening. These experiences suggest that temporal flow is more a lens of the mind than an absolute reality. Death, therefore, would not be an erasure, but a shift of that lens, opening access to a broader perspective. When we reflect on time as a construct, even the idea of birth is transformed. If past and future coexist in a larger fabric, perhaps what we call a beginning is only the entry of a consciousness into a given space-time coordinate. The I that experiences life may already exist on another level, merely assuming a form in the theater of matter. In this scenario, the soul does not begin with the body and does not end with it. It crosses time, but is not governed by it. This perception also has practical implications. Seeing time as an illusion, we realize that the fear of death is, to a great extent, fear of losing continuity. But if continuity does not depend on the clock, it cannot be lost. What changes is the form of manifestation. Thus, death ceases to be an enemy and becomes part of the constant cycle of transformation that characterizes reality. This view, far from being merely consoling, invites us to live with more presence. If eternity is available in the now, each instant is precious and contains within itself the totality of life. Quantum physicists speak of the universe as a field of possibilities, where all states coexist until observation defines an update. Perhaps time functions in a similar way, not an inevitable line, but a field in which different moments already exist, and consciousness traverses them like someone navigating an ocean. Death would be only a change of route, not the destruction of the boat. In this sense, linear time is useful for practical survival, but it does not describe the totality of existence. By recognizing time as an illusion, we also change our relationship with legacy. What we do, think, and feel is not lost along a line running toward oblivion. Each act reverberates through the fabric of reality, remaining in some way inscribed in the greater field of consciousness. This perspective gives meaning to the human effort for beauty, justice, and compassion. Even if our bodies unravel, what we radiate remains present, beyond the reach of temporal erosion. Thus, death reveals itself as passage and not as end. Time, instead of a prison, becomes only a tool for earthly experience. The soul, free from temporal bonds, continues its journey in dimensions that escape our habitual perception. Understanding this does not eliminate the mystery, but opens space for a fuller life, where each instant is lived not as a race against the clock, but as an expression of the eternity that has always been here. The idea that consciousness is not limited to a single existence is one of the oldest and most persistent in human history. Cultures on every continent have spoken of reincarnation under different names and metaphors. For some, it is the soul's journey in search of improvement. For others, a natural cycle in which life renews itself indefinitely. In any version, the notion is present that the soul's essential memory is not lost, but remains inscribed in a broader field that goes beyond individual experience. The concept of cosmic memory approaches this mystery. It is not about remembering dates or trivial details from other lives, but about a deep record that preserves lessons, bonds, and impressions of existence. This memory would not be stored in the physical brain, but in a subtle dimension of consciousness, comparable to a universal archive. Some call it the Akashic records, others the collective unconscious. But the central idea is that human experience is not lost with death. It is merely transferred to a repository that transcends time. There are curious indications that fuel this hypothesis. Small children reporting vivid memories of other lives, for example, constitute a phenomenon studied by serious researchers. Often, they describe details that are later confirmed historically, even without any access to such information. These reports do not definitively prove reincarnation, but they point to the possibility that consciousness extends beyond the biological frontier. It is as if the soul carries with it fragments of its journey, which emerge when the rational mind has not yet consolidated. From a quantum point of view, this memory can be understood as information present in a non-local field. Just as entanglement shows that particles can share states regardless of distance, cosmic memory could be available at a level where time and space are not barriers. Upon incarnating, the soul would access portions of this archive, integrating past experiences into the present. Forgetting in this sense would not be a failure, but a resource. To fully live a new life requires that we not carry the conscious weight of all the previous ones. This view sheds light on certain tendencies and inclinations that arise without an apparent explanation. An early talent for music, an instant affinity for a certain culture, or even a deep fear with no identifiable cause can be echoes of this larger memory. What we call vocation or instinct may be in part an inheritance of previous experiences inscribed in the field of consciousness. Reincarnation in this framework is not just repetition, but creative continuity in which the soul uses each life as a laboratory of learning and expression. The notion of cosmic memory also helps explain why certain human connections seem to surpass chance. Encounters that generate immediate familiarity, bonds that withstand time, or intense conflicts with newly met people can be signs of shared histories in other cycles. These experiences do not prove reincarnation, but they become more intelligible if we accept the hypothesis that the soul carries memories that resonate when it meets old traveling companions again. From a spiritual point of view, reincarnation offers a transformative ethical perspective. If our choices reverberate beyond a single life, then each act has consequences that go beyond the immediate. It is not about punishment, but continuity. What we sow returns as learning, allowing the soul to mature across its experiences. This view shifts responsibility beyond the current biography, showing that what we do today can influence the path we will walk in another existence. Cosmic memory, however, should not be understood only as an archive of the past. It is also a source of inspiration and intuition in the present. Often, ideas arise as if they came from a place we do not consciously command. It can be a creative spark, an unexpected solution, or a hunch that guides us. It is as if the soul had access to a bank of accumulated experiences, from which it draws elements that illuminate the current path. Thus, cosmic memory becomes an ally of daily life, not just a metaphysical hypothesis. As we reflect on reincarnation, we realize that death dissolves as a final barrier. The soul would not be erased, but recycled into new bodies and contexts, always in dialogue with the greater memory. This does not reduce the uniqueness of each life. On the contrary, it highlights its importance. Each existence is unrepeatable, a unique opportunity to experience the universe from a specific perspective. But at the same time, no life is isolated. All are part of a continuous flow that shapes and enriches the journey of consciousness. This perspective invites us to look at our biography with humility and responsibility. If each gesture is inscribed in a greater memory, the present gains density. Living is not just about satisfying immediate desires, but about contributing to the quality of the path that will follow. Reincarnation ceases to be a mere belief and becomes an ethical horizon. Everything we do reverberates, everything accumulates, everything accompanies us, albeit subtly, in the soul's long crossing through the cosmos. The idea that consciousness transcends the body and does not go out with death may seem abstract, but there are ways to bring this view closer to concrete experience. Throughout history, different traditions have developed practices that, each in its own way, seek to open a crack in everyday perception and reveal something of the immortality of the soul. These practices are not just mystical rituals, they are resources that allow us to experience a quality of presence that defies time and suggests that there is something in us that remains, regardless of external circumstances. One of the most universal paths is inner silence. When the mind is constantly occupied with stimuli, desires, and worries, consciousness seems identified only with the flow of thoughts. However, when it quiets, the perception arises that there is a witnessing space, a point of observation that remains untouched. This silent observer does not age, does not change with the passing years, and is not confused with personal narratives. It is like the sky that remains open regardless of the clouds that pass. Recognizing this dimension is already a glimpse of the immortality of consciousness. Conscious breathing is another powerful resource. When we inhale and exhale attentively, we perceive that each breathing cycle connects the inside to the outside. The air that enters now has already been in plants, oceans, and other bodies. It circulates around the planet in a continuous movement. Feeling this, we understand that we are not a separate entity, but part of a living network that renews itself at every moment. The consciousness that observes this flow is not bound by the limit of the body, but expands to encompass the very rhythm of the cosmos. There are also practices linked to effective memory. When revisiting striking memories, we can notice that the self that observes these recollections is not the same one who lived the events. The body has changed, the mind has matured, but there is something constant that recognizes itself in all phases. This thread of continuity points to an identity deeper than the biographical one, suggesting that consciousness carries within itself a spark that does not depend on the passing form. This perception can be cultivated intentionally, bringing to the surface the feeling that life is a continuous journey and not an isolated episode. Another way to feel the immortality of consciousness is through connection with the collective. Moments when we feel part of something greater, whether in celebrations, rituals, artistic experiences, or even in instants of genuine compassion, reveal a trans-individual dimension. It is as if consciousness expanded beyond the I and recognized itself in the we. These moments offer the intuition that the soul does not end at the skin, but extends into the common field we share. Living with this perception, even in flashes, dissolves the fear of death and strengthens the sense of continuity. Contemplative practices in nature also play an essential role. Observing the cycle of a tree, the movement of the tides, or the sunrise puts us in touch with rhythms that exceed the scale of human life. Nature is in itself a living metaphor of immortality. Everything transforms, but nothing is lost. By surrendering to this contemplation, consciousness perceives that its essence participates in the same logic of renewal. Death, thus, ceases to be an absolute interruption and comes to be seen as a change of form, like the fall of a leaf that nourishes the soil for new shoots. These practices, when integrated into life, serve not only to calm the mind, but to expand it. They reveal a quality of presence that does not depend on time, the body, or circumstances. The sensation of immortality does not arise as dogmatic belief, but as intimate experience, even if brief. And once this experience occurs, even in flashes, it becomes a permanent reference, capable of transforming the relationship with life and death. There is also an important practical aspect. Living the immortality of consciousness does not mean disregarding earthly life, but valuing it even more intensely. If the soul is continuous, each instant of existence gains depth. Each gesture becomes an opportunity to express what remains. This vision encourages more conscious choices, more meaningful relationships, and a more authentic presence. The everyday world ceases to be a mere passing backdrop and becomes a sacred stage for the manifestation of the eternity that dwells within us. At bottom, feeling the immortality of consciousness is not an exercise in imagination, but a training of perception. It reveals itself in the silence between thoughts, in the rhythm of breathing, in the continuity of the self through changes, in connection with others, and in the contemplation of the universe. All this shows us that we are not merely bodies destined to disappear, but manifestations of a principle that renews itself infinitely. In traveling this path, we have seen that consciousness is not just a reflection of brain activity, but a living field that connects to the very structure of the universe. The discoveries of quantum physics, the accounts of near-death experiences, the notion of entanglement, and the perception that time may be an illusion make up a powerful mosaic. This set of ideas points to something profound. The soul does not go out with death, but continues to vibrate in dimensions that escape our everyday perception. Recognizing this transforms the way we live. The fear of finitude loses strength when we understand that we are part of a larger network, a continuity of energy and memory that crosses generations, cultures, and even lives. Life ceases to be a race against the clock and becomes an opportunity for expression, learning, and contribution. Each choice, each gesture, each intention reverberates in a fabric that never breaks. Accepting the immortality of consciousness does not mean denying the value of earthly existence, but elevating it. Each moment becomes precious because it is a point at which the eternal manifests in the here and now. We are part of a cosmic dance that knows no end, and the body is only one of the temporary forms of this expression. If this journey resonated with you, write in the comments the phrase "consciousness is eternal," so we know you made it to the end. And if this content made sense and you wish to follow more reflections like this, subscribe and continue exploring with us the infinite mystery of the soul and reality.